Welcome back for another deep dive with us. We're going to be tackling a pretty complex topic today, managing diversity in Syria. We've got some thought-provoking stuff to unpack. This piece by a Syrian author, Malkon Malkon, really caught my eye. He asked this really interesting question. What if Syria's real problem isn't actually diversity itself, but more about how it's been kind of, manipulated and used?
Yeah, it really kind of flips the script on how we usually think about diversity and conflict, doesn't it? It makes you dig a little deeper into the history and the politics behind it all.
Yeah, for sure. So before we even get into the whole managing diversity part, maybe we should take a step back and just get a clear picture of what diversity in Syria actually looks like.
Well, historically, Syria has been this incredibly diverse place. I mean, we're talking a huge mix of religions, ethnicities, all kinds of languages. And for centuries, this diversity wasn't really seen as a weakness. It was actually seen as something that made their culture rich and strong.
So at what point did things change? When did this idea of diversity being a problem start to pop up?
It's a complicated story, but I think one of the turning points was the rise of Pan-Arabism around the middle of the 20th century. Now, if you're not familiar with that period, Pan-Arabism was all about uniting Arab countries based on this shared language, culture, history, that kind of thing. And one of the big figures in this movement was Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt at the time.
Right, and Syria and Egypt actually did join forces for a bit there under Nasser's leadership. Back in 1958, they formed the United Arab Republic.
Exactly. And even though that union eventually fell apart, it left this lasting impact. Those ideas of Pan-Arabism had really taken root in Syria. And this is where we start to see this shift in how people view diversity. The focus on this one Arab identity started to kind of overshadow all the other cultural and religious identities that existed within Syria.
So it wasn't about wiping out diversity completely, but more about making it fit into this bigger idea of Arab unity.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. But this idea of one single identity became even more pronounced when the Ba'ath Party came into power in 1963.
Ah, the Ba'ath Party. They were a huge force in shaping Syria's political scene, weren't they?
Absolutely. And their approach to diversity was a lot more forceful. They were pushing a very specific version of Arab identity, often shutting down any cultural expressions that didn't fit into that mold.
Can you give us an example of that? Like, how did that suppression actually show up in everyday life?
Well, one thing they did was use tons of visual symbols and slogans everywhere, all promoting Arab nationalism. Just imagine walking around Damascus back then, seeing these slogans plastered all over government buildings, schools, even public squares. It was a constant reminder of what the dominant ideology was.
It sounds almost like they were trying to create this monoculture, even though Syria had this historically diverse landscape.
That's a great way to put it. And this whole ideology wasn't just limited to visuals and slogans. It actually worked its way into the core legal structure of the country. The Syrian Constitution of 1973 basically solidified this single Arab identity as one of the main principles of the state.
So even the Constitution itself reflected this shift in how diversity was being seen and handled.
Precisely. If you look at the language used in the Constitution, it stresses this Arab identity over and over again. For example, it refers to Syria as the Syrian Arab Republic and the Arab nation. It's not just a descriptive term. It's like they're saying this is the defining characteristic of the state.
Okay, so we see this emphasis on one single Arab identity in both the political rhetoric and the actual legal framework of the country. But how did this actually play out in terms of policy? Did it lead to specific measures that impacted different groups within Syria?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. One clear example is Article 21 of the Constitution, which outlines the goals of the Syrian education system. This article is very specific about creating a generation that's totally infused with Arab nationalists, socialists, and scientific thought.
So education basically became a tool to instill this particular ideology from a young age.
Exactly. Think about what it would have been like growing up in Syria during that time. Your textbooks, your teachers, even the stuff you did outside of school, it was all geared towards shaping you into this model Arab citizen. And it could very well have been at the expense of other parts of your cultural or religious identity.
And to think, even the 2012 Constitution, the one that came out during a time of huge upheaval and calls for reform, even that Constitution held on to a lot of those same elements.
Yeah, it's pretty striking. It's almost like this idea of a singular Arab identity had become so deeply ingrained in the Syrian system that even when they were trying to reform things, they couldn't quite shake it off. Which brings us back to what Malkon was saying. He's arguing that the problem isn't diversity itself, but how it's been twisted and used by those in power.
And he's saying that this manipulation has turned diversity into more of a curse than a blessing for Syria. So how did this manipulation actually play out?
Well, Malton points out this interesting contradiction. While the Ba'ath Party was publicly pushing this message of pan-Arabism and unity, they were also playing these sectarian politics behind the scenes.
So they were preaching unity while secretly playing favorites and exploiting divisions. That seems pretty hypocritical.
Yeah, exactly. And that's really the heart of Malkin's argument. He's saying that diversity became a tool for control, a way to stir up division and tension that ultimately kept those in power in charge.
So instead of embracing diversity in a way that could have benefited everyone, they were using it to their advantage, further solidifying their control over the Syrian people.
Exactly. And this manipulation, as Malkin puts it, is what turned diversity into a curse, fueling conflict and really undermining the very fabric of Syrian society.
Yeah, it's like that old saying, divide and conquer, right? When you turn people against each other, it's easier to stay in control. It's a strategy that's been used forever, and unfortunately, Syria is no different. It's almost like they were twisting the whole idea of unity they were promoting, using the very differences they were supposedly trying to erase to hold on to power.
Exactly. And according to Malkin, this manipulation is at the heart of so many of the problems Syria is facing. But he doesn't just leave us with this bleak picture. He actually offers a different vision for Syria's future.
Okay, so what does that look like?
Yeah.
How does he think Syria can move past this legacy of, diversity being used as a weapon?
Well, Malkin's a big advocate for what he calls a civic identity, something that goes beyond all those ethnic and religious lines that have become so politicized. He believes that Syrians need to start seeing themselves as citizens, first and foremost, united by shared values and working towards a common goal.
So instead of defining ourselves by our differences, we find unity in our shared humanity and what we want for the future. It's a pretty powerful idea, especially in a place where those differences have been exploited for so long.
It is. And Malkin argues that this shift to a civic identity is crucial if Syria is going to build a fairer and more just society. He imagines a Syria where everyone feels like they belong no matter what their background is.
But that's a pretty tall order, isn't it? Especially after decades of division and manipulation. How do you even start to build that kind of civic identity in a society that's so fractured?
Yeah, it's a long process for sure, and there's no quick fix. But Malkin thinks education is a really important piece of the puzzle. He believes that schools can teach young people about the principles of citizenship, human rights, and respecting diversity.
So rather than pushing this one single identity, we give them the tools to actually navigate a diverse society, to see those differences as a strength instead of a threat.
Exactly. It's about fostering critical thinking, empathy, and a sense of responsibility towards each other. And it's not just about what happens in the classroom. It's also about giving people from different backgrounds opportunities to interact and work together out in their communities.
So things like community projects, dialogue groups, even just shared public spaces where people can connect and build relationships.
Exactly. Creating a culture where inclusivity is the norm, where diversity isn't just tolerated but actually valued. And that, according to Malkin, is how you start to dismantle all that manipulation and build a more unified and resilient Syria.
There's a very hopeful vision, but I can imagine there are some pretty big hurdles to overcome. What kind of obstacles stand in the way of building this civic identity?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is going to be overcoming the deep mistrust that exists between different groups in Syria. Decades of sectarian politics have created these really deep divisions.
So it's not just about changing laws and policies, it's about changing how people actually feel about each other.
Right, and that requires a lot of open communication, reconciliation, and building trust. It's about owning up to past injustices and working together to heal from them.
And all that takes time, patience, and a real commitment from everyone involved.
Absolutely. And it's not just about what's happening inside Syria. Malkon also talks about the importance of connecting with the wider region.
Oh, interesting. So he sees this shift in Syria having implications beyond its own borders.
He does. He imagines a Syria that's not only at peace with itself, but also actively promoting human solidarity and understanding with its neighbors.
So instead of being a source of instability in the region, Syria could actually become an example of peaceful coexistence and cooperation.
Exactly. Malkon really believes that Syria, with its rich history and diverse culture, could play a key role in bringing peace and understanding to the Middle East.
It's a bold vision, but a very inspiring one. It suggests that even in a region that's been marked by conflict and division, there's still hope for a different path. But how realistic is it? I mean, let's be honest, the Middle East is incredibly complicated with a lot of historical baggage and competing interests.
You're absolutely right. There's no denying how complex it is and how many challenges there are. But Malkin's point is that this complexity shouldn't make us give up. It should motivate us to act. He believes that by embracing a civic identity and promoting regional cooperation, Syria can help break down those barriers that have kept the Middle East divided for so long.
It's like he's saying we can be more than just another nation state. We can be a force for positive change in the world.
Exactly. It's a vision that challenges us to think beyond borders and see ourselves as part of something bigger, something more human. And it's rooted in this belief that when you truly embrace diversity, it can be an incredible source of strength and resilience.
It's a really powerful message, especially these days when it feels like the world's so focused on what divides us. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Malkon's work, what do you think are the most important takeaways for our listeners?
I think the biggest one is that diversity itself isn't the root of the problem in Syria. It's how that diversity has been twisted and exploited for political gain. That's what's really caused so much damage.
It's such an important distinction to make because it's easy to just think, oh, diversity automatically leads to conflict, but Malkon's argument is so much more complex than that.
Right. And it's a perspective that can be applied in so many other places, too. It makes you question those simple explanations for conflict and think about the historical and political forces that shape how we see and deal with diversity.
Yeah, totally. It's about asking who's actually benefiting from these divisions and how they're being used. So apart from that core argument, what other insights from Malkon's work do you think would be valuable for our listeners?
His vision for a future Syria built on this idea of a civic identity is really powerful. It puts shared values, human rights, and a sense of belonging for all Syrians first, no matter their background.
It's a really hopeful vision, but like we talked about, there's some huge challenges to overcome. So what can our listeners do to engage with these ideas more deeply? To go beyond just understanding the problem and start thinking about solutions?
Well, one thing that could do is look into organizations that are working on interfaith dialogue and peace building in Syria and the surrounding region. There are so many grassroots groups out there doing amazing work to bridge those divides and build a more inclusive future.
That's a great suggestion. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by how complex these issues are, but supporting those who are working towards peace and understanding is a real, tangible way to make a difference. So to all our listeners out there, we hope this deep dive has given you a new way of thinking about the challenges and the possibilities of managing diversity, not just in Syria, but in our own communities as well.
It's something we all need to be talking about, no matter where we're from or what our background is. And like Malkon reminds us, it's a conversation that needs empathy, critical thinking, and willingness to look beyond those easy answers.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time, keep on diving deep.